All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, there's probably nothing I enjoy more than watching conventional wisdom be proven wrong in real time, since we live in a country where conventional wisdom increasingly is disconnected from the wants and the needs of average people in terms of lack of worker power, lack of ability for dissenting views to be considered or aired in the media. It's actually very difficult often to find real test cases. Luckily, at least for now, in this country, we still have relatively free and fair election where everybody gets a vote. And it's the only thing that they can't control, whatever QAnon may tell you. With some new verified exit poll data of the entire electorate from a firm called Catalyst, we now know a lot. It shows a lot of myths are being busted. First and foremost is my favorite. Demographics is not destiny. In 2020, the majority of Trump voters were women and people of color. And for Republicans, they are an increasing share of their voters. Did they win either in absolutes? No, absolutely not. But the breakdowns are stunning, and they're worth diving into even more. There was a lot made about white male grievance and Trump's rise. And yet, the only group that voted less by share for Trump in 2020 was actually white men. His largest marginal increase over 2016 votes actually came from non-white men and women even outpacing men. Let's continue. Latino voters beat out Asian Americans in the largest increase of turnout. And yet, that increased turnout, which was made a lot of by mainstream Democratic consultants and more, did not work out for them that well. Didn't happen in Florida with Cuban Americans, but Biden lost voters amongst Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, many others. In Texas and Wisconsin, Biden actually lost 9% of the relative Latino vote to Trump. Just look at that graph. It's stunning. A lot of this has been generally known, but seeing it in absolute terms is still amazing. I used to get in trouble for saying this at the time, but 2020 ended up empirically being the least racialized election of our lifetime. Nearly half of Latino men voted for Trump. 1 in 8 black men did too, while white men exited the coalition. The key point is this: racial attitudes, not your physical race, was actually what mattered more. Perry Bacon Jr. actually had a great analysis on this last week using similar data, where he writes that the increase of voters of color towards Trump is given by the fact that small but substantial enough minorities of black, Latino, and Asian voters are more susceptible to class-based analyses of politics, while white college-educated voters are much more amenable to racial explanations. The propensity of white college-educated voters attempting to virtue signal will never stop being funny to me, especially when actual voters of color act completely differently. But ultimately, the final composition of both the Trump coalition and the Biden coalition matters a lot. It actually offers big warnings to both parties in 2020. Biden's ultimate vote composition was as follows: 32% non-college educated white, 29% college educated white, 20% black, 12% Latino, miscellaneous others. For Trump, it was as follows: 58% non-college educated white, 27% college educated white, 8% Latino, and then tiny percentages of others. The glaring problem is right there in your face for both parties. Dems can try as they might to have an emerging Democratic coalition, but 71% of the people who voted in 2020 were white, and nearly a third of their entire coalition are people despised by the cultural elite. In fact, it's very telling to me that college-educated whites are actually a smaller contingent of the overall Democratic base, but they run the entire party, not to mention the rest of the country. And the lesson for the Dems is actually easy. Stop being run by college-educated whites, or at the very least, stop talking and messaging like them, and you will win not only back more non-college-educated whites, you'll also win back a lot of minority voters. As for the Republicans, where to even begin? It's stunning to me, given the relative success that the party had, that after January 6th, it would only go all in on trying to piss off the college-educated whites even more with its embrace of Stop the Steal. It's actually the reason they lost the Georgia Senate seats, and Trump's brand is why they lost in 2020. In fact, if just the same number of college-educated whites voted for Trump in 2020 as they did in 2016, he would be president right now. As for the minority gains, they're fascinating, but let's not pretend that they're substantial in ways that the non-college educated white split was in 2016 from Obama to Hillary. The lesson to me is that this is probably the high water mark of the culture war. It is exactly how close and how many voters you can get by simply being opposed to cultural liberalism. And frankly, not bad at all, don't get me wrong. but simply not enough, especially without someone like Trump, who is so polarizing at the top. It will be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to change. There's really one way to win more votes, and that is to appeal to more voters. Since opposition to cultural liberalism is already a social agenda you've got covered, you're good. But clinging to libertarian economics basically ensures the GOP are such losers in the future they can't even win in a system which gives them an advantage in the Electoral College. I think it's pretty amazing, Crystal, to go through some of this data. It just destroys so many, things away that people think. It's like, women and people of color are the majority of the Trump coalition. Go ahead and say that on MSNBC.
People were so mad at Brunig over that.
They were pissed, but it's true. Look, that's the facts, ma'am. Same thing. White men decreased their vote share for Trump. I think the most telling thing about it, for the Democrats, actually, when's the last time you heard that 1/3 of the people who voted for Biden were non-college educated whites?
Yeah.
There are more non-college educated whites who voted for Biden than college educated whites. Who runs the party? Who runs the country? They're like diametrically opposed groups, which I think is so fascinating. And the tug of war over their preference we see in everything. SALT taxes, tax policy, everything. On the Republican side, same thing. Look, a lot of Latino men and black men too will come with you because they just hate liberals. And that's enough for like a couple of votes.
Yeah.
Not enough to win more. You have to deliver on policy. So that's just really, I think, the major lesson for me on both fronts.
Perry Bacon Jr., by the way, who
Great
you cite, always good analyst. I worked with him at MSNBC. Very sharp thinker and also very honest. And just actually looks at the data and extrapolates from there. And so a couple things. First of all, one of my favorite tweets after 2020 was like, we asked white men to do better.
Yeah.
And they did.
And they did. That's true.
It's like the one
You
group.
shamed them.
The one group that Democrats improve with. But also, it's incredibly logical that was the result when the entire Biden campaign was pitched to affluent white suburbanites. So you shouldn't be shocked when it's affluent white suburbanites who show up in droves for you. That's who the entire campaign was crafted and pitched towards. So when you look at these maps of where the biggest shifts to the Democratic column were, they were all in suburban areas largely. Actually, Biden did worse in urban areas almost uniformly across the country than Hillary Clinton did. So you can see, and he also marginally improved in rural America too by a tiny bit.
Like 3 or 4%.
Right, but even those small amounts for Democrats in rural America do ultimately make a difference here. What's distressing to me about politics in America today is there's actually zero class basis for how people vote.
Yes.
If you look across, you can't possibly say one party's a working class party and the other party's. There's just almost no correlation between class and voting patterns. So what Perry is really pointing out there is actually what you're seeing is an ideological, culturally ideological divide. Latino and black voters who are more conservative, though that part of those demographic groups that are more conservative, Trump was such a polarizing figure that they found themselves having to pick which side of the cultural divide am I on? And increasingly, because there is a significant percentage of both of those demographic groups, those are culturally conservative, that was the side that they picked. And so since economics really didn't, it's insane that it didn't
play a role.
It didn't figure into this election almost at all. The one thing I would say is the checks really landed for people, and the lack of a second check is probably why Trump didn't end up back in the White House. But in general, neither of these campaigns pitched an economic program. You had no idea what Trump would do if he got back in office economically. You had no idea what Biden would do if he got into office economically. That's just not what they centered their campaign around. And so it ended up being just about the cultural divide. So moving forward, is that the way the politics continues to be? I would say that Biden is leaning away from that type of politics. He's trying. He's not very online. He's not engaging in the stupid, let's jump on board with the Dr. Seuss fight or these other cultural flashpoints. In fact, he seems to have an instinct to try to deflate them out of the gates. But, when you have such a gridlocked political system here in Washington, basically all that gets done is culture war rhetorical
Speeches.
signaling.
Right.
So it's hard to move away from this type of politics.
Yeah, I guess if I did leave out one thing, which is hope for if you want a better country. 70 million people didn't vote. 70 million. Almost, 170 million or so did, but there's still a lot of votes out there.
Yeah, and that was with extremely high turnout
that's what I was gonna
election.
say. And actually, there was a huge number of first-time voters in 2020. Think about that. At all ages, all the way up to 65 and all the way down to Gen Z and more. There's a lot of votes out there if you can inspire people, but you got to try something different. So if you want to be locked into the current expectation, I can tell you the Republicans will lose, the Democrats will narrowly probably win on the presidency, lose or tie whenever it comes to the Senate and the House. And I think we all know how shitty those types of politics are. But if you want a different one, there's a lot more votes out there for the taking.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.